Let's talk about the Rolex Daytona. The new Rolex Daytona, reference 126500, released last year at Watches and Wonders in conjunction with the Daytona's 60th anniversary. This is a watch that replaces a hugely popular outgoing reference 116500 that brought back the black bezel to the Daytona for the first time since the 80s. Of course, this is a detail that's associated with some of the most popular vintage Daytona references like the 6263 and the 6241. The new reference sticks with the black bezel, though it changes up the execution a bit. We'll get into all of that. And I've been wearing the new Daytona for the last few weeks, and I've got some thoughts on not just the watch, but also what it says about Rolex and where they're coming from with this design. Now, right off the bat, I have a lot more of my thoughts on this watch now live over at thedeeptrack.com. I'll leave a link to that down below. Now, before we get into it, I think it's worthwhile to look back at a couple of specific references that show where Rolex has been coming from with their design decisions lately and how it's reconnecting them to their roots in a way that we haven't really seen from them over the past 15 to 20 years. Now, I want to start with the 126600 Sea Dweller, the 43mm Sea Dweller that was released in 2017. This watch brought back a line of red text at the bottom of the dial in a very overt nod to the watch's past. Of course, the first prototype Sea Dwellers in the 60s had a single line of red text, and then the first production versions of the watch had 2 lines of red text. The first Submariner to receive a date in the late 60s also had a line of red text at the bottom, which was phased out by the mid-70s. So seeing Rolex bring this back in a modern Sea Dweller was a really interesting move, and one that was an acknowledgement of where they had been. And it was one of the first steps in Rolex kind of reconnecting some of their watches, some of their collections with their past. The next reference is the 124270, the Explorer, which moved back to its 36mm size after being at 39mm for the prior decade. Now, traditionally, the Explorer has been a 36mm watch, and Rolex is generally a brand that kind of moves in one direction and doesn't really look back, but them moving back to the 36mm reference was an acknowledgement of the history of that collection. And then, of course, we've seen more things more recently, like the slimmed out lug on the Submariner reference. Now, all of these small things add up to tell a story of Rolex kind of taking more care to connect with the roots of some of these collections in a way that they haven't really been known to do. Now, moving into the new Daytona collection, we see this same trend take root, and there's a few design decisions that have been made with this watch that reconnect with some of the roots of the Daytona collection as a whole. Now, I mentioned that black bezel that the 116500 brought back. Of course, it's retained here in the 126500, but the execution is changed up just a little bit. Now the bezel is lined with the same metal of the case and the bracelet. Now this is done in a move to protect the bezel itself from chips or cracks. I don't know if that was really an issue on a large scale with the last generation. It's certainly not something that I experienced with any of the Daytonas that I've spent time with, but this is more than just a practical move. Now this is kind of a throwback to how those black acrylic bezels were set into the assembly of the case, which had a ring around them. Now visually here on the new one, that ring kind of breaks up the visual heft of that black bezel just enough to provide a little bit more balance to the watch overall. And that's something that's carried through into the dial with the proportions of the rings that surround the subdials, which have also been thinned out a bit in conjunction with a slightly thinner bezel. But that's not the only move that references older Daytonas. We also see the hour markers get some attention here. They've been thinned out. They're much longer bar-like shape that is much more akin to the older original Daytonas right on up to the turn of the century, actually. When Rolex first put their own in-house movement, the 4130, into the Daytona around the turn of the century, they changed the design as a whole, which included these new hour markers that were a little bulbousy, a little stubby, kind of looked like small bullets or boats, and the container for the lume in there left a bit of an awkward dead space at the tip of the hour marker. In my opinion, it's not something I was ever really fond of, so I've been hoping to see Rolex move back to the shape of an hour marker. It's a small detail, but there's quite a few of them on the dial here, so it adds up to make a really big difference here. And while this isn't a watch that's exactly known for its legibility, it does help clean things up a little bit here overall. Now, one of the things that Daytona is known for is just how great it wears on the wrist. And that's been throughout its lifespan. This new one is no exception to that, but there is an important change that's been made to the case here that's worth noting. So in the last generation of the Daytona had actually 2 different case designs. Now the steel references had a much svelter mid case that terminated in a point near the lug, and they were also asymmetric cases. The idea being to balance out some of the weight of those screw down pushers and the crown over on the right side of the case. The precious metal cases were symmetrical, and they had a broader foot to the lug. In the new generation, all the cases are now the same, and the steel references get that same precious metal case design. So it wears slightly wider than the prior generation in steel, but it's almost indecipherable, but it is there. And truth be told, I'd probably prefer the more elegant mid case of the prior generation, which is probably gone at this point. Thankfully, the measurements stay mostly the same. This is still a 40mm watch that's 12mm in thickness on the dot, and it's around 47mm from lug to lug. And of course, the shape of the undercase, as well as how the case wall rounds out, means the watch sits beautifully on the wrist, and this is still an exceptionally comfortable watch to wear all day. On the inside, Rolex is moving to their 4131 automatic chronograph movement here, which gets a lot of the new bells and whistles that Rolex has been adding to their in-house movements over the past generation, including the Chronergy escapement, Parachrome hairspring, and the Paraflex shock absorbers, all that kind of stuff. It's all here, and of course it is a superlative chronometer, so it will keep time within plus or minus 2 seconds per day. In my time with the watch, it's been well inside of that. Now there's a comment I want to make about the bracelet. This of course retains the polished Centerlink Oyster bracelet here that we know the Daytona for, but it does not have the glide lock or any form of quick adjustment system within the clasp itself. It only has one half link that you can pull out and push back in. So if you can size the watch perfectly to your wrist with that half link pushed in, then you will be able to pull it out for a little bit of movement there when you need to on a hot day or after a salty meal or whatever it is. But if you need that half link pulled out to get the perfect fit, then you're kind of out of luck here. So I feel like Rolex has a good solution here, and it would be nice to see it make a move into a watch like the Daytona. So what does this watch say overall about Rolex? Well, as I mentioned, Rolex has been kind of making a greater effort to reconnect to their roots with their new releases, and this watch is no exception. Because of that, that almost makes the last generation something of an outlier in the bigger picture, especially if they're going to continue down this route. And I think that's a good thing. Of course, that watch has its own kind of baggage with it. It had become kind of the face of the hype-driven demand, and fairly or unfairly was kind of the barometer of the health of the secondary market. So, you know, I see this as Rolex creating some distance between this new generation and this last generation by making this new generation a little bit more closely identified with the older references of the Daytona. Now, whether or not that will actually be the case moving ahead remains to be seen. This watch is still trading for between $30,000 and $35,000 in steel, depending on your dial color of choice, which is more than double its MSRP of $15,100. Now, even at MSRP, this is not an inexpensive watch, but it's much easier to judge at that price. And at that price, I think this watch is quite compelling. It's good looking, it's comfortable, it's easy to wear every single day, and it's Rolex, so it's made to be worn. Whether people will treat it that way, of course, is another story. At $30,000 to $35,000, it becomes a different proposition, and there are, of course, many other really interesting, beautiful chronographs out there, potentially more aesthetically pleasing movements from more prestigious brands. It's just a different game at that price point. So whether it's worth that or not, I think will largely come down to the individual. But I will say at that price, if you want something that you're going to wear all day, every day, this is still a good option, as I still find it more wearable than a watch like the Vacheron Constantin Overseas, which is arguably a better watch than the Daytona. But if I had them both in the watch box, I'd probably find myself reaching for the Daytona more often on a daily basis. But overall, there's still a lot to love about this new generation of Daytona. It looks a little bit different, but it's still recognizable from across the room. Again, it kind of goes back to its roots just a little bit more, but this watch is, I think, a healthy starting point for a new generation, kind of a hard reset, soft reset, whatever you want to call it, for the Daytona line in general. And I think it's created some healthy space between itself and the 116500 and everything that came with that. Now, as I mentioned, I have a lot more of my thoughts on this watch and what it's like in use and in day-to-day use now live on thedeeptrack.com. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We'll be uploading videos weekly. And a reminder that the Deep Track is reader supported. I'll leave a link to our Patreon down below. That'll do it for this one. Until next time, take care.